Hi, and welcome to Empathy for the Devil. This season is brought to you in partnership with London Records.
Amy Winehouse's story contains themes of substance use, addiction, alcoholism, and alcohol poisoning. We also discuss eating disorders, bulimia, and depression. There will be resources in the show notes for you to check out if you're affected by any of the issues we will be discussing.
Hi, welcome back to Empathy for the Devil Season 2.
Whey! Guess who's back?
We are back. It's really, really great to be back here. And what are we thinking, guys?
Excited.
Well, very excited. And thank you so much for all your comments and emails and messages. We've been absolutely blown away by the impact that this podcast seems to be having. Could never have imagined it. It was like a nice idea in the CAF one day, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
But thank you, and we're delighted to be back here for season 2.
Yeah. Before we start, maybe we should reintroduce ourselves again for new listeners or people who haven't seen the show.
Good point, because people might be thinking, who are these mugs?
Yeah.
And what have they got to say? And why should they be able to say it?
Yeah, and why should we listen?
Quite right too.
So, are you starting, Chula, or shall I start?
I can start.
Okay, go.
My name's Chula. I am a psychotherapist and former musician, and I'm the clinical director and one of the co-founders of Attune. And I have a private practice, and I've been working in the addiction field since 2005. And in my 20s, I was in a band and we had a record deal and it was all going great. But unfortunately, I became addicted to heroin, and that actually put a premature end to what was a career that I'd wanted all of my life. Luckily enough, in 2003, I came into recovery, and I've been clean and sober ever since, with a lot of support and help from other people and a fellowship.
Thanks, Tuna.
Oh, thanks, Chula. Hi, my name's Sam. I'm an accredited coach, and I was a former artist manager for many years, actually. As were you, actually, Matt, for a time being, weren't you? For a short time. Not for a short time.
Felt like a long time. Felt like a fucking eternity.
Yeah, it kind of does, doesn't it? I'm also an ordained interfaith minister and co-founder of Music Support, along with Matt.
Hi, my name's Matt, and I am an accredited holistic coaching practitioner and an addiction professional. And before that, I worked in record labels for a long, long time. And during my time in record labels, I suffered really badly from addiction and mental health issues. I was really fortunate to get into recovery in 2006. And for about the last 10 years, I've been working in mental health and addiction recovery in the music industry. And through Attune, I work with bands and artist-facing professionals and help them overcome some of the obstacles that I encountered and try and make sure they have a bit more support than I did. And so, on to the first episode of the season, and today we're talking about Amy Winehouse. Amy was a complex, multi-layered human being, a cheeky, mischievous, funny, vivacious, self-destructive, multi-million selling, award-winning, tortured soul. A rebellious daddy's girl who wanted to do it her way, but had a strong need for connection with others and just to be looked after. A remarkable young woman thrust into a kind of media and cultural stardom she just wasn't ready for, dealing with her issues and coming of age in the critical public eye, all while creating a small but timeless collection of songs and recordings that will live forever. Her story, like so many others we've talked about, reminds us that addiction can affect anyone, and of a renewed, urgent need for compassion and support in the unforgiving world of fame. And guys, today, looking at Amy's story, I'm really interested in looking at what it was that drove her to be so self-destructive and to see actually why she thought so little of herself that she literally chipped herself away until she was gone.
Yeah.
And why that happened, and why when someone like Amy, who on paper had it all, at the end of the day, why she came to the really, really sad and tragic end that she did.
So, Matt, what made you choose Amy?
Well, it's a really good question. And one of the main reasons actually is because so many people said to us, when are you going to talk about Amy Winehouse?
Yes.
And I really resisted, actually. I kind of felt that Amy was almost untouchable, and that we probably shouldn't go there. And then actually I thought, well, no, let's talk about her in the way that we do, respectfully and compassionately, and without any kind of scandal or salacious gossip, and let's try and see what was going on really, really gently. And then maybe we can learn something, we can all learn something, and maybe the industry can learn something.
Yeah.
I think what interests me about Amy is how differently she was treated by the press and the media in terms of being a woman.
Absolutely.
And also, it was so visceral, wasn't it? Her decline. It's shocking. So yeah, I'll be really interested to dig into this one. And what what we try and do is, we're not portioning blame. We're not looking for scapegoats. That's too fucking easy.
No, not at all. I think really it's the power of addiction, isn't it? That's the sad tragedy of her story. And just even in these modern times when there is a lot of treatment available, the power of addiction can overtake that and bring someone to their end.
And that's another reason, actually, why I ended up thinking it would be great to talk about Amy, because I was one of those people that almost didn't get recovery. It took me a long time in some really troublesome active addiction before I actually found recovery. And so I can really relate to the very slow decline that Amy experienced, and the kind of all the attempts, and there were many attempts to get into recovery, and she never quite got it. And it was very much her very public decline was during the years of my very early recovery. So I was paying a lot of attention to it. And in fact, I was just reminiscing with producer Emma just before we started, that I once bumped into her in Camden, and I was in really early recovery, and she was coming out of a toilet, not in a great state. And I just remember thinking at the time, wow, I wonder if she's going to make it. Just tragic.
That's so sad.
Yeah, it's funny actually, because when I was working with Razorlight, they were all knocking around the same Camden area and going to that, I can't even remember what it was.
Mixer.
Good Mixer. Yeah. But also, what's that pub?
Hawley
Arms. I remember Razorlight, we did like a rooftop show. I think that was after she passed away, actually. But yeah, I mean, in Razorlight's early days, they were all knocking around together. So yeah.
And that was part of the problem, actually. The being an it girl on the scene. But we'll get to that.
Yeah.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
So should we light a candle for Amy?
Yeah, let's.
Yeah.
So Amy, lovely Amy, this is for you. So we're going to hold Amy with compassion and grace.
And dignity.
All the while remembering that she wasn't just an addict or a troubled soul. She left us with an incredible musical legacy.
Absolutely.
Outstanding.
Yeah.
Once in a generation type.
Thank you, Sam.
And, diving into the beginning of Amy's story, actually, it's, she was also a daughter and a granddaughter and a sister. And that's really where we're going to begin. Amy was born in 1983 in North London. Her dad was Mitchell, her mum was Janice, and she had an older brother, 4 years older, called Alex. And she was born into a musical family. 4 of her uncles on her mother's side were actually jazz musicians. And her dad, as we know, Mitch, was a semi-professional singer. As he says, a semi-professional singer who had to drive a cab as well to make ends meet. And he introduced her very early to Frank Sinatra. In fact, she said in one of her interviews that she actually grew up thinking that he was Frank Sinatra, which is quite sweet. And from day one, apparently, she was a force of nature. She was very, very willful, a real character, didn't really like to listen or be told what to do. Very, very strong personality, loved singing, sang from a very young age. And she was really close to her grandmother, Cynthia, Mitch's mother. And Cynthia was a larger than life character, very, very glamorous, and had gone out with Ronnie Scott, who, for those who don't know, was I think he was a saxophone player, and he also started the world famous Ronnie Scott's in Soho, which was a jazz club. And Amy really romanticized that. And what was really important to Amy was the Friday night dinners at Cynthia's, where they would all get together.
At Cynthia's?
It was at Cynthia's, and they'd all get together and they'd eat and they'd drink and they'd sing and they'd dance, and you can just imagine it. And probably Mitch was up there doing his Frank Sinatra, and I'd imagine Amy.
Did anyone
joining
play
in.
piano?
Oh, there were lots of musicians in the family.
So So when you said about her uncles, was that Dad's brothers?
That was on the other side.
Oh, Mum's brothers.
Was Mum's brothers. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So she had music on both sides.
Yeah.
So there was a massive family influence in terms of her musical direction.
Yeah.
Rather than sort of going somewhere more contemporary, it's because it was rooted there in her family.
Absolutely. And it also clearly symbolised connection and family connection, and probably safety and love, and and all of those incredibly important values she would have had from a really, really young age, embedded in music, and particularly jazz music, because they were all massive, massive jazz heads as well.
So you can imagine everyone getting up and doing a bit of a turn, can't you?
Absolutely.
And so she would have started doing that from when she was a top. Yeah, lovely.
Yeah. So it was really clear from a young age that Amy had talent, and not only did she have vocal talent, she had writing talent, and she was this massive personality. And you can see that there's so many documentaries out there about Amy, and you can see this really cheeky young girl looking at the camera, and and she's sassy and she's spirited and she's just wonderful. And so you can see the talent literally oozing out of every pore, alongside this attitude, and just this big presence.
Yeah. It's definitely one of those musicians where you can see there's a natural talent, despite any kind of training or outside influence. There's just something there, a spark of creativity.
Coupled with rebellion. She was very clever. She was really, really gifted, clever student, but she didn't like to be told what to do. And so she actually didn't do very well at school. She was happier doing her own thing.
Kind of makes me think about being willful.
I was just about to say that, actually.
Yeah. My mum always used to say that
addicts.
about me.
Yeah.
You always, you were kind of born, came out, and you just would never like to be told what, what to do. But I also think that can be quite tricky when you run into addiction and, things that, I don't know, where you you think you know best, don't you?
Yeah.
And then, that kind of will can be quite a barrier to actually admitting that you can't handle something.
Well, there's this thing they say to you in rehab that your best thinking got you here.
Yeah.
And it is very much that way, because, for me, I didn't think I was really doing anything wrong. I thought it's my right to take drugs if I want to, and I'm making that choice. But
and I can handle it. Thanks very much.
Even when it's going horrendously wrong.
Yeah.
There is a description of addiction as self-will run riot.
Yeah.
And it's kind of like, and it's until the self-will runs out, and the person is able to surrender and say, actually, I can't do this on my own. And unfortunately, Amy never really reached that place, or if she did, it was a little bit too late. But going back to what you said, Sam, there's a lot in you that reminds me of Amy. Kind of that kind of defiant, spirited attitude, and I was thinking about that a lot as I was doing all the research and stuff. Yeah, absolutely. I was, God, that's exactly like Sam. That's exactly like Sam.
Oh,
it's like,
I feel very flattered saying that, actually.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Can you sing?
No, fucking terrible.
So, like every young child, Amy's life wasn't all a bed of roses, and a lot has been said about the parental divorce, which happened when she was 9 or 10. And basically, Mitch left the family home and eventually remarried. And Janice also remarried. It has been said that this hit Amy very, very hard. Although Amy herself has said that it really didn't bother her, and that actually it meant with her, when her dad moved out, she didn't have to do what her mum said anymore. And she could wear what she liked, go out when she liked. So, it depends who you listen to. Amy's friend Tyler James, who wrote a very, very interesting autobiography about his time with Amy, actually said that the biggest hole in Amy was her missing dad, Mitch. I tend to have a little bit more balanced view of it and just think, well, a lot of people experience parental divorce, and of course it's going to affect them, but it's never really going to be the single driving force that causes someone to become a chronic alcoholic or addict later in life.
No, I think it's definitely a trauma in a sense, but that's very different depending on the particular scenario. But it's interesting that she kind of found that freedom, like the rules perhaps were taken away. So of course a teenager's going to love that, or a young teenager. But I've worked a lot with people from, adults who are in families where the parents divorced. And one thing I've come across a lot is that children often feel like it's something to do with them, or even that it's their fault. And it's not logical, but there's an unconscious part of them that thinks, oh, well, if I was more, or if I was better, or if I was loved by them more, then they would have stayed together, which obviously isn't true. But I think sometimes people carry that without even knowing.
And what we do know about Amy actually is she actually talks about, because what happened in the divorce was that Mitch had an affair that he then ended up, leaving the family home for and marrying the lady that he'd had an affair with.
Right.
And Amy writes in What Is It About Men about how she is probably destined to repeat the same familial pattern that was put there by her dad, effectively. And she told her dad that the song was about him. So clearly there was something going on. But, whether or not it was the be all and end all, I'm skeptical.
Well, that's so insightful, isn't it?
Yeah, really insightful.
For her
and
to
actually,
realise that.
a lot of the lyrics, especially on Frank, are really, really insightful.
Yeah.
When did she start songwriting?
Well, she started songwriting in her teens. She was
Was she in bands and things like that? Or was she just quietly writing at home? Or?
No, she was in a band. I can't remember what they were called, but they were a Salt and Pepper type band
she
with
loved
one of her best
Salt and
mates.
Pepper, didn't
She
she?
loved Salt and Pepper. There must have been seen to be believed. I'm sure there's some footage out there. But she went to theatre school, and then she went to the world famous Sylvia Young Academy, which, for people who don't know, is a kind of it's one of the most famous feeder schools in the UK, and a lot of people come out of Sylvia Young. A lot of boy bands came out of Sylvia Young, actually. And then she went on to the Brit School, which is kind of like, the UK's very own Fame Academy, which people like Adele have come out of the Brit School as well. So it was very clear that some kind of entertainment was going to be in her life. But, during this time, she did show signs of disordered eating. All of her friends from that time talk about bulimia as something that was present but not really talked about, that there was a lot of shame around it. It's been said that she also explored her sexuality, and that she might even have had a relationship with one of her female friends. And actually there's a great quote that's attributed to Amy where she said, "I'm not a lesbian until I've had 4 sambucas."
None of us are, love.
But it's kind of like there's a lot in that quote, because you can read it as a funny quote, and you can also read it as, well, I've got this stuff going on, but I'm not really comfortable exploring it, and I need to lubricate myself with some alcohol before I'm comfortable going there.
Yeah.
So just going back to the teenage bulimia, did you get a sense in your research that that was ever looked at?
I got the sense that it was looked at to the extent that she was on antidepressants.
But was she treated? Was there any interventions?
I don't think she was, other than somebody prescribed her antidepressants.
Okay.
So at some stage there was some kind of treatment, but I wasn't able to find any more detail about it.
Okay.
Because nowadays someone with an eating disorder of that kind would be sent to a rehab where they might be sitting next to a heroin addict or an alcoholic and doing that same kind of work and treating the eating disorder like any other addiction.
And let's not forget, this was like the late 90s, early noughties, not 2024.
No.
And people just, there were certain things that people just didn't talk about.
Brushed under the carpet. Yeah.
And it's been said, we're jumping forward a bit, but Amy's eating disorder really kicked in when she started seeing pictures of herself. So when she became vaguely famous, a little bit famous. Yeah. And I remember we were talking about that with Karen Carpenter in the last season.
She saw her, when that started, when she saw herself come out from behind the drums and centre stage. I mean, imagine just having to, look at yourself over and over and over again, and if there is a sense of, well, I mean, it'd be the same for anybody, wouldn't it?
Yeah, being a picture in a newspaper or magazine, you're then going to compare yourself with other people in newspapers and magazines rather than just seeing yourself at home in the mirror.
Yeah. Absolutely. So going back to Amy's teenage years, it sounds like there was a lot of love around her. She wasn't short of love. Despite the parental divorce, she seemed to be well supported, although she was quite secretive about some of the deeper stuff that was going on. And of course, you asked about songwriting earlier, Sam, and actually songwriting was her biggest outlet. Songwriting was, it was almost like a diary for her. She had this little, almost like a little girl's diary that she wrote lyrics in her lovely distinctive handwriting. And Amy said herself about songwriting a little bit later down the line, I write songs because I'm fucked up in the head. I don't write songs because I want my voice to be heard, because I want to be famous. I write songs about things that I have problems with, and I have to make something good out of something bad. So she had that. And it's like that was her real outlet. And obviously that was what formed the basis of Frank, her first album. Yeah.
There aren't actually that many artists that write in such a naked biographical way.
Yeah.
I mean,
the lyrics are so personal.
Yeah, I mean, it just reminds me of lovely George Michael. There are some artists that just write. It's directly from out of their, diary, isn't it? Out of their journal. I don't know. There's something so
visceral.
Oh yeah, there's something so vulnerable and delicate about songwriters that write in that way, that you really feel like you know them.
Absolutely. And also when you look back on the lyrics, like some of Amy's lyrics were really prescient. It's kind of like she was almost telling us what was going to happen. Like in that song, What Is It About Men? She actually says, my destructive side has grown a mile wide. And over a relationship, and it's kind of like it's uncannily similar to what actually did happen.
Well, I was listening to her on the way in, and the thing that struck me was the sadness. There was a real sadness, but I couldn't tell if I was projecting that because I know what happened to her in the end, sadly. But I think the feelings were there already. There was a sadness and maybe even some depression.
Well, as we've discussed, we know that she was on antidepressants for some of her teens, so there was clearly something there. But so moving on, let's talk about Amy as a singer, because clearly Amy wanted to be a singer.
Yeah,
she had an amazing voice, as we know. And following her stint at the Brit School, she actually started singing in the National Youth Jazz Orchestra, which was pretty amazing.
Wow.
And there's some early recordings of that, doing some jazz standards absolutely beautifully and amazingly, and in her own unique Amy way. And that's actually how she got her first manager at 16. And it's a very famous story. She ended up being managed by a young scout called Nick Shemansky, who heard these recordings. And the company that Nick worked for, within about a year or two, had been merged with 19 Management, which, as we know, is the management company owned by Simon Fuller, who was the guy behind the Spice Girls and Pop Idol. So really, really quickly, Amy went from kind of being a jazz singer on the scene with a young manager who thought she was really cool to being managed by one of the biggest global impresarios of his time. And because of all their incredible connections and matched with her huge talent, it wasn't long before Amy had a massive record deal. So really quickly, she was thrown into this world.
Yeah, into the pop world as well, from the jazz world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's almost sort of a weird sort of twist of fate, really, that she ended up within
Absolutely.
Simon Fuller's orbit.
She's on and signed to Island Records, a pop and rock label,
Who signed
effectively.
her? Darkest?
Yes, I think it was. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the Island Records at the time were, a bit of a hit factory, and they knew what to do. Between 19 Management and Island Records, they knew exactly what to do to turn Amy into a star.
Yeah, major label and major management.
Exactly. Exactly. And so it wasn't long before she'd been matched up to some producers of her dreams, and she was able to make Frank, which was a record that was kind of a combination of her early jazz influences, but also bands like the Fugees and Lauryn Hill.
Oh, yeah.
She loved Nas. She loved reggae. She was a massive fan of the Specials, actually.
Oh, wicked.
Ended up singing on stage with them later on in her career.
Right.
So she was able to make almost the album of her dreams. And so in 2003, I think, Frank came out and it did really well. It was a credible hit that was very well received critically. It was nominated for a Mercury Music Prize, and Amy Winehouse had arrived.
Yeah.
And she was cool. She was it. She was a Camden girl.
Yeah.
So it was like, on the one hand, there was this jazz head, effectively, who then became a bit of a rock chick, and it was kind of like it was such a unique vision, and she was developing. She didn't quite have the beehive yet, but she was developing a really strong look, and she was very much a ladette in a culture that was embracing ladettes as well, and she drank pints and shots, and she liked pubs and pool, and all of that, and then. Slightly unfortunately, and you'll really relate to this, Sam, is she got stuck between cycles, which is to say that the promotional cycle of Frank ended probably after about a year to 18 months. And that's quite a dangerous time for an artist because there's not a lot to do. It's kind of like, right, well, what's next? Write the new album and record the new album and start the whole cycle again.
Yeah. Well, that's what we see that quite often, though, don't we?
Yeah.
We see people come off tour or come to the end of that cycle, and then they're at home, and they haven't got a routine, they haven't got a focus, and then the mental health issues and the addiction can.
Yeah. And Amy had some money. She'd had some quite nice advances from her record deal and her publishing deal. She had bought a flat. She was the only person in her age group, because don't forget, she's still like 20 at this time. She's still
And this
really
is all
young.
off the back of Frank.
Yeah.
So she bought her own flat in Camden.
Yeah.
Was knocking around, had a social life.
Her house like became the social centre because she was the only one in her kind of peer group at the time
Who had any
her
dosh.
own place.
Yeah.
But she also lost connections with with her older friends, made new connections. Actually, one of the main things that happened is that she got bored.
Right.
And what do people do when they're bored? They drink. And it's quite well documented that by about 2004, when she would have just been like 21, she already had quite a troublesome relationship with alcohol, to the extent that her manager, Nick, tried to do an intervention with her. And different people have reported it in different ways. But basically, a number of people, including family members, were involved, and management. To quote the famous song, they tried to make her go to rehab, and she said no. So that's basically what happened in 2004, and was to be an experience that would pave the way for the song Rehab, obviously, which actually I think ended up being a bit of a millstone around her neck. So during this time for Amy, there was a big series of losses of some of the most stabilizing factors in her life between about 2004 and 2006 that would have had a massive impact on her.
In between the first and second album.
Yeah. in between the first and second album. And one of them was that she parted ways with her manager, Nick, for various complex reasons I won't go into here. But she wanted to leave 19 Management, and she wanted Nick to come with her. But Nick, actually, much as he wanted to, felt that his loyalty was with 19 Management because they'd given him his first big break, I think. So they very sadly parted ways.
I would imagine also she didn't go to rehab, which is what perhaps he might have been hoping for her.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and things to that effect have been said, but I've not heard them directly from his mouth. So it would be...
Well, as an ex-manager, I can imagine that perhaps would have been a factor.
Yeah,
I think it's probably fair to say he saw the writing on the wall, maybe.
Maybe.
You know. And then something else that happened that I find really fascinating is she was separated from her guitar on stage. She was basically told by management and record label that in order to connect with an American audience, she really needed to have more stage presence, more eye contact, and therefore she needed to come out from behind the guitar.
That reminds us of somebody,
doesn't it? That reminds us of Miss Carpenter. Absolutely. And, you know, the fact that for some musicians, they really need that barrier. They really need that wall or that comfort blanket, or however you want to describe it. And, you know, you can see if you just Google Amy playing the guitar, there's a lot of eye contact with her fingers. As opposed to with the audience, you know, and it's kind of like, it's almost like she went from being a musician to being a star.
I mean, you can understand why record company, management, whatever, would suggest that.
Totally,
because it is about the, you know, it's about that, isn't it? It's about the contact that you're making with people in the audience or whoever, or watching TV or whatever. And it is a barrier. I think now, I guess we would sort of recognise more what psychologically how that supports a performer. And actually, if you're gonna, you know, you don't just whip the walking stick away, or
it's like a shield when you're on stage.
A shield is a really good way of describing it. And then a few other things happened. Her mum got diagnosed with MS, multiple sclerosis, that would have been a really big blow anyway, but also would have reduced the actual amount of contact that she had with her mum and the amount of energy that her mum was able to give her, I think, as well.
So things they could do together,
So it was that would have been quite a big deal for a young lady who kind of, you know, let's face it, you know, you still need your mum in certain situations, you know, even when you're a young up-and-coming pop star. And then that was all really badly exacerbated in 2006 by the death of Cynthia, her beloved grandmother. And that was really the one that shook her the hardest. And her grandmother died a little bit later. You know, it wasn't, I don't think it was until about 2006 while she was recording Back to Black, actually. But it was kind of like, it was the end of a series of losses and stabilising influences that were taken away from her.
So guitar gone, so your safety blanket gone, mum not well. And
Nick gone.
Granny died. Ouch.
And then, of course, that's all without mentioning.
And Dad was around at this time.
Dad was around. Dad was a big part of her life.
Okay.
Absolutely. You know, she had, a lot's been said about her relationship with Mitch. And I'm of the view that he was always there and that she absolutely adored him. You know, she didn't have Daddy's Girl tattooed on her arm for nothing. And Mitch was always around. So it's kind of like, you know, and she worshipped him. She loved singing with him. There's some great footage of them singing together.
Well, it was almost like he was all she had left at that point.
Yeah.
You know,
that's
in terms
true.
of support.
But there's a massive but coming up, because it's also during this time, unsurprisingly, that she meets Blake Fielder Civil, who was, she met him in a pub, you know, round about 2005, I believe, fell hopelessly in love with him, and had a massive, tumultuous on-off relationship with him. He was into crack and heroin. She wasn't.
At the time they met.
At the time they met. And there was a lot of infidelity. There was an ex-girlfriend of his in the picture. And I mean, I don't know if you can, I feel slightly wrong saying this, but the only good thing that came out of that relationship at that time was the material for Back to Black.
Right.
Because very quickly she was able to write this incredible album and then go and record it. And of course, she got put together with Mark Ronson, and they created some absolute magic together. And I think actually Mark was probably a really stabilizing influence on her for the period of time that they were together. But Back to Black kind of was created and recorded and released really quickly. It was like, it was, you know, it was only a matter of months really, but on the back of these series of losses culminating in the loss of this relationship with Blake.
Yeah. And I think there's even a line in the title track where she says, you know, you go back to her and I go back to Black.
There
or
is,
something
absolutely.
like that. Yeah.
Oh, is that him going back to his
That's
ex?
him going back to his ex-girlfriend.
Oh, really?
And her going back to the black of her depression.
Yeah.
And Amy's relationship with Blake, I mean, there's been so much written about it. But one of the things that really sums it up is she said the line, "You love blow and I love puff," which basically meant that he was taking heroin, and she used to say Class A drugs are for mugs, and was happy with her smoking marijuana.
Okay.
God, that makes me sound like a school teacher.
A drug of choice was marijuana.
Marijuana, don't smoke marijuana,
She liked to
children.
spliff.
She was a weed smoker,
Okay.
and he was a heroin smoker, basically. And actually, after Back to Black was released and became massively successful almost overnight, propelled ironically by the single Rehab, they got back together again. And that's why this line, "You love blow and I love puff," is particularly poignant, because actually during their rekindled relationship, Amy actually took up heroin and crack.
Yeah.
And there's a huge part of me that thinks,
Ouch.
well, actually she did that to keep up with him, to kind of to keep the connection.
Yeah.
To keep the connection.
Yeah. And you know, and I've been around the block a few times, as you guys know, and I've been in certain relationships where one person tries to stop and it breaks a connection. And I've been in other relationships where I remember when I said I was going to stop drinking, and the person I was in a relationship with said, "Well, we're not going to have a connection anymore."
Yeah.
You know, and it's kind of like, so I can really imagine that Amy almost felt compelled to join him and start taking heroin and crack so that she could be with him, so that she could be on the same level as him. And that, unfortunately, was the beginning of a period of drug addiction for her. So coming back to Black, which absolutely propelled her to another level of fame, an extraordinary level of fame. And she was regaled for her writing talent, her performing talent. She became a worldwide superstar. There was absolutely no doubt about it that this was Amy Winehouse.
Incredible image.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hugely powerful.
Really striking.
But, you know, I can't help but wonder whether Amy's perception of fame was different to what actually arrived, to the fame that she actually achieved. Because, you know, let's not forget, her perception of fame to begin with was, she just said, I want to be on stage and sing and make people happy. I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of what she said. Not this global megastar that had been separated from her guitar. This is someone who wanted to sing, not be a star. And it's also someone who said, "I'm a musician, not a model."
Well, that's the thing. She was a jazz musician, really, wasn't she? She didn't want to be a pop star.
Yeah.
There's so many people that want to be famous. And, you know, I get that, I understand why. And then there are people who just want to do what they do because they love doing it. And the byproduct of that is being famous. I mean, there are many, many artists that want to be famous and love all of that. But then there are some, I don't know.
Well, there's a lot that want to get famous, but then when they get there, they don't like it.
Well, they don't like it,
Yep.
but then, but I suppose you could argue with Amy is that she made a concerted effort not to be fucking famous.
Yeah.
It's not like she joined a pop band or was in a girl group or
No, yeah.
you know, she was playing with the youth bloody jazz orchestra. You know, it's like you couldn't get
Yeah.
more like.
Well, the music was the important thing.
Yeah, I mean that's clearly stating, you know, what it is that she loves doing.
It's very true, and you know, and there was this machine basically that created. Let's just say that the machine created an Amy Winehouse that she didn't particularly want to be, and then the world demanded this Amy Winehouse.
Yeah, yeah.
It was also at the time that the press was really starting to turn on Amy and kind of talking about Amy the junkie, Amy the wino, Amy the delinquent. There were police things starting to happen with Blake. Amy got slightly involved in that. There were some assault charges brought upon her and she was in and out of court for that.
Right.
And you know, part of me thinks that she sort of believed the hype. And it's almost like she took on this role, this persona that she'd been given. Amy Winehouse created by the music machine to sell records and gig tickets.
Yeah.
Amy Winehouse created by the press. And she became this archetype and lost herself completely.
Yeah, and just as you're saying that, I'm thinking about George.
Yeah.
Michael, you know, I mean, there's this whole kind of fragility around an individual's own sense of identity. And, you know, that's barely established, is it, when you're a late teen, early 20s? I mean,
Absolutely.
your brain doesn't even fully develop until you're in your late 20s.
Yeah.
Well, the public persona becomes more developed than the true self.
Exactly.
Absolutely right. And I believe that the only way that she could access that version of Amy Winehouse was through drink and drugs and the other behaviour that she was engaging in.
Or maybe the only way that she could do Amy
both,
Winehouse.
the only way she could tolerate it.
Yeah.
It was both. It was like a snake that eats itself. It was the only way she could reach it and the only way she could deal with it. And so she was in this horrific self-fulfilling spiral, unfortunately. Poor thing. And she and there was seemingly no way out.
Yeah. And at the point where it was probably quite clear to everybody, including her, that she needed to go to rehab, she couldn't really go back on her song, could she?
No.
In some ways,
No.
she had to, she didn't want to lose face and then go, okay, well, I will go to rehab. She wasn't going to
the
do
millstone
that.
around her neck. Although she did.
In the end.
She went to a lot, and we'll get to that towards the end of the podcast.
But it's almost like that song acts as the ego,
Yeah.
which says, you know, they told me to go to rehab. I said, no. And I'm still fucking saying no.
Yeah.
And that's what I think. And I know her ego is saying, I know what's best for me. It's that willfulness again that we were talking about in terms of her being a little girl. It's that self-will, isn't it? It's that fuck you. It's that, you need the self-will to get you. I mean, it's a coin with two different sides, isn't it? The willfulness pushes you out into the world and gets you to do things that are amazing and has a chance of giving you meaning and purpose and being your authentic self. But on the flip side, then if you run into trouble and you can't adapt and that will is too strong, and then you've got the record, then everyone knows that's what I think or what I used to think. I'm going to lose face, and
that's my line in the sand. I cannot go back to that. Yeah. And Amy, unfortunately, as we've said, became infamous. Along with being famous, and infamous is when you get really well known for a shameful act, and it's disgraceful how much shame was piled on to this young lady. It really is, and in so many different ways as well. And I would like to talk about the way that I think there was quite a lot of sexism and misogyny poured towards Amy's direction.
Yeah, because if you look at male musicians who have drug problems, it's often celebrated, isn't it? And they're seen as very rock and roll and it's all great. And even when they're falling to pieces, there were points with Pete Doherty when he was in a right old mess, but no one was really concerned. And he
was a tortured poet.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Whereas Amy was a junkie.
Yeah.
And a train wreck.
Yeah, and weak-willed and all those sort of things, having a moral deficiency. But in actual fact, she was just an addict, just like any of us.
Absolutely.
I think there's something about the. I mean, listen, she looked awful, bless her, because of her heroin addiction and eating disorder. It's shocking to see somebody that is
malnourished.
that looks like that, malnourished. Exactly. It looks like death. It's really.
It was scary. There was
frightening.
one.
It's frightening.
But I think that one of the things that happens is it's okay for men to look like that. Women aren't allowed to look like that. And I do think part of that is because women's mental health is treated very differently from men's mental health. And also because it's almost like if a woman looks like that, she's abusing her God-given body that was meant to bear children.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's almost as if, women are held up to a higher standard. And I think that's because they can be mothers at some point. And I think the idea that a woman can be anything other than, sucking your dick or bearing your children. Sorry.
Whoa.
Sorry. I'm going to say that because it's the Madonna whore complex, isn't it?
Okay.
Sorry. It is.
We're back on track.
No.
Yeah.
It's the way women are split into
one or the other.
Yeah.
And to see a woman willfully defy and be neither somehow upsets the patriarchy, doesn't it? But I'm not, and when I say that, that I'm not blaming men, because patriarchy isn't about men. Patriarchy is about a societal way of thinking that men also suffer under as well, because men aren't allowed to have feelings in that system. So it doesn't do men or women or people that are neither any good. It doesn't do any of us any good at all. But I think you're right, Matt. I think that there's that's all right. Doesn't often happen. I think there's a shame. There is a disgust that is projected onto women. That men perhaps don't have to labour under.
And that was palpable with Amy. And it wasn't just the press. It was a lot of people who should have known better. She became the butt of jokes at award ceremonies and with comedians and all sorts of stuff that was it was a public humiliation. It's a bit like a public flogging, in fact.
Well, it's
really distasteful.
Who thought it was a fucking good idea for a comedian or whatever at an award ceremony to ridicule a young person who is obviously struggling?
Absolutely.
I mean, I feel the anger inside me now. It's like, what the fuck?
Yeah. And true. And just to wrap this segment up, there's a slightly challenging narrative that I've heard bandied around that actually everything would have been fine if Amy would have just had a baby. And it might well be true. She might well have yearned for children, and she might well have gone on to have had children. But actually,
whatever.
We know that having a baby doesn't cure addiction.
Jesus fucking Christ, having a baby cures fuck all. Let me tell you that much.
Exactly.
And at the root of that is a real misconception around what addiction is.
Yeah.
Because there's so many people who quite wrongly feel that addiction is a choice and that people are making a bad choice. But we know that isn't the case. And actually it's an illness that needs to be treated.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that then leads to all the prejudice and the judgment and the stigma.
Absolutely. So going back to what you were saying, Chula, about getting into recovery, because, a lot's been said about Amy and why wasn't more done to help her.
Yeah.
And I'd just like to dispel that myth for once and for all, is so much was done to help Amy.
Yeah.
So much was done by her and by other people. And, you know, there's very well documented there were tour cancellations galore. There were date cancellations. There were recording cancellations. People tried and tried and tried. And often, actually, it was Amy who insisted on not cancelling because she just wanted the show to go on.
Yeah.
But also, she really did try and stop. And actually, the hard drugs didn't last for that long. They were probably a year to 18 months. And once she kicked the heroin and crack, then obviously we know that addiction migrates. And that's when the alcoholism really kicked in and was compounded by the ongoing bulimia. But we know that she went to many, many hospitals and treatment centres. We know that she tried cold turkey. We know that she tried replacement therapy. We know that she was practically a resident at a very famous London private hospital that she began to treat almost like as a second home. You know, what seems to me to have happened is that she was always trying to deal with the symptom, not the cause.
Yeah.
And, you know, that those of us who work with addiction professionally is actually, we know that the substances and the behavior is a symptom. And the symptom is used to try and numb out whatever the cause was. And there seemed to be a real reluctance to look at what the cause was.
Yeah.
So they were always trying to work with, well, let's stop the drinking, let's stop the drug taking, let's stop the bulimia, rather than looking at what the root causes were.
Yeah. Well, as we know, abstinence doesn't equal recovery. You know, abstinence might be the foundations that recovery need to be built upon.
Absolutely.
But actual recovery is doing the work, doing the therapeutic work. Be that in a fellowship, be it in a rehab, be it in therapy, you know, one-to-one or in group. It's the work that has to follow on the underlying stuff.
Yeah. Otherwise, relapse happens.
Yeah.
That's the thing. So it's like, it's all very well, you know, if I can just stop, everything will be fine. And then you do stop, and then you manage to stay stopped for 30, 60, 90 days. But if you don't treat the underlying stuff, then eventually a relapse is probably going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I like to think that given a little bit longer, she might have got into recovery, but I could be wrong.
Yeah.
And, you know, and sadly, we'll never know, because what we do know is that after quite a prolonged period of abstinence, Amy sadly once again relapsed and died of a combination of alcohol poisoning and the cumulative effects of her bulimia.
Like Karen.
And so, like Karen, and so we'll never know, other than she tried and she didn't quite make it.
I mean, you could almost imagine that the bulimic illness that she suffered from being an early teen had a really significant detrimental impact on her heart.
Yeah.
And her,
Absolutely.
and her organs and her physical health
Yeah,
and well-being. And you could almost imagine that had she not perhaps had that, she may not have died.
And that's the strength of the co-occurring stuff. Absolutely. And, you know, and there's another thing is that all of her childhood heroes, people like, you know, Ray Charles and Donny Hathaway and Dina Washington, they all suffered immensely from either addiction, alcoholism or mental health issues, or all three. And there might have just been something deeply ingrained in Amy that just said, that comes with the territory.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like, but the sad truth is, we'll never know.
Like a self-fulfilling
And so she left us, leaving behind an incredible legacy. Only 2 albums and a posthumous album, but an amazing set of songs, and just literally, to quote Morrissey, a light that will never go out.
Yeah. And a voice that you can't forget.
Absolutely.
So, Matt, where are we leaving Amy today?
Well, I think there's only one place to leave Amy. I've thought about it for a long time, and I thought about maybe the Grammys. And then I remembered that actually at the Grammys, she just had 2 weeks of enforced rehab. Let's leave her at a Friday night dinner. with Cynthia and all of her family members.
Yeah.
You know, someone tinkling on the piano, loads of connection, loads of family, Amy in her absolute element, giving a little performance, and just, you know, God's in his heaven and all's right with the world.
Oh, that's really lovely, Matt. I don't think I'm even going to add to that. So thank you, Amy. Thank you all that you gave us. God bless.
Thanks, Amy.
Thanks to you, Matt. You held that story really well, and
Thank
you know lots of really important points around what her life meant, but also what she had to endure. And she sounds like a troubled individual, but then when you hear her sing, she's like an angel. There's just so much there that just soars above all the things that she had to face.
Yeah.
And it is terribly sad that she was taken away from us so soon and without the chance to really live a full life.
Also, thank you, Matt, for that. And I'm also thinking you as a dad of girls of various different ages, it must have been quite...
It's really difficult. It's really, really difficult. And, and my heart goes out to her family, and especially to Mitch as her dad, who's come under an awful lot of fire in the last kind of 15, 20 years since she died. And, at the end of the day, he was just a dad doing his best. Yeah. And he didn't know what to do.
No, we can't blame him.
Nobody knows what to do. It's impossible, and I just hope that we've painted quite an even story of just a kind of a complex mix of cross addictions and fame and circumstance, and something that even towards the end, Amy knew that she was in trouble and she tried to do something about, but it was just out of her control.
And do you have a one for the road for us?
Oh yes, one for the road. Now I'm obsessed with this podcast. It's a podcast called A History of Rock in 500 Songs.
Right.
And it's just absolutely sensational. It's very detailed, quite train-spotty. And,
right up your street then.
It's all written and narrated by a remarkable man called Andrew. And I just urge anybody who's got any interest in how modern music came to be to have a listen. It's quite an ugly story. As the title suggests, there's 500 episodes. They're not even all recorded yet. Right. I've only got to episode 85 myself.
God,
and I'm barely
to 85 already.
I'm barely out of the mid-60s.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh. But it's really, really good. And Andrew, if you're listening, we'd love to have you as a guest on our podcast. That's all for today. Meet us back here next week as Sam takes us on a journey through the life of the musical icon Prince, from his early days jamming in his friend's basement in Minneapolis to his shocking death from an accidental overdose in 2016.
If you like Empathy for the Devil, please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts. And why not share this episode with a friend to help spread the word?
Any comments, questions or requests for artists, we are on Instagram at we_are_tune. And don't forget to check out season 1 of the podcast, where we discuss Kurt Cobain, Whitney Houston and many, many more.
Thanks once again for joining us and staying to the end as well. And we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. See you next week.
Bye.
And if you've enjoyed Empathy for the Devil, why not check out Hit That Perfect Beat, the London Records story, a deep dive into the iconic label behind some of the biggest hits of the last 50 years. See our show notes for more details.